Jake Matthews gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched as he muttered under his breath. This can't be happening. The GPS on his phone had officially given up, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but endless dirt roads and towering trees surrounding him. He had taken what was supposed to be a shortcut through a small town, but now, as the sun dipped lower behind the horizon, he was completely and utterly lost. This was the last thing he needed. He was on a tight schedule, heading to a business meeting 2 towns over, and now he was stuck in the middle of some tiny town that probably didn't even have a gas station. He glanced at the dashboard. His fuel gauge was dangerously close to empty. Frustrated, he pulled over near an old-fashioned diner, the neon sign flickering as if it could barely hold on. With a sigh, he stepped out of the car, stretching his stiff limbs before striding inside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet filled the air, momentarily distracting him from his irritation. "Well, you look lost." A soft, teasing voice came from behind the counter. Jake turned, and for a second, he forgot how to breathe. The woman standing before him had the kind of beauty that wasn't flashy but impossible to ignore. Her dark brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, a few stubborn strands framing her face. Her eyes, warm hazel with a hint of green, studied him with curiosity, and her lips curled into a knowing smile. She wore a simple apron over a faded t-shirt, but there was something effortlessly captivating about her. Yeah, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "GPS gave up on me and I have no idea where I am." She chuckled, wiping her hands on a towel. "Well, welcome to Willow Creek. Population, not very many." "You must have taken the wrong turn about 10 miles back. Where are you trying to go?" Jake exhaled, leaning against the counter. "Riverton. I have a meeting there in the morning." She winced. "That's still a ways off. And unless you have a spare tank of gas hiding in that fancy car of yours, you're not making it there tonight." "Great, just great. Is there a gas station nearby?" He asked, hoping for a miracle. She shook her head. "Not one that's open this late, but there's a bed and breakfast down the road. Stay the night, fill up in the morning, and you'll be on your way." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had no choice. "All right, can you point me in the right direction?" She tilted her head, considering him for a moment before grabbing her jacket from a hook behind her. "I'll walk you there." "It's only a few blocks, and knowing your luck, you'd probably end up lost again." He scoffed, but a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Funny," she grinned, leading him out of the diner. The night air was crisp, and the town was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. "So do you always rescue lost strangers, or am I just lucky?" he asked as they walked side by side. She laughed, glancing at him. "You're lucky. And technically, I'm not rescuing you. I'm just making sure you don't wander into the woods and get eaten by a bear." "A bear? Seriously," she smirked. "You never know." Jake found himself chuckling, the tension in his shoulders easing. There was something incredibly easy about talking to her, even though they'd just met. "I'm Jake, by the way." "I figured," she said, nodding toward his suitcase. "Your name's on the tag. Clever." "And you are," he prompted. "Lena," she replied. "I grew up here. My family owns the diner." He nodded, taking in the quaint houses lining the street. "Small town life, huh, must be nice," she shrugged. "It has its moments and its downsides. Everyone knows everything about everyone. No secrets here." Jake couldn't imagine living in a place like this. He thrived in the fast-paced world of business, constantly moving, never staying in one place too long. The idea of a town where everyone knew his name, his past, his mistakes, it was suffocating. "You don't seem like the type to stay in one place," Lena observed, as if reading his thoughts. He smirked. "What gave it away?" she grinned. "The expensive watch, the way you keep checking your phone even though there's probably no signal, the restless energy." "You're always on the move, aren't you?" Jake hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, I don't like staying still for too long." She hummed softly, as if she understood something he wasn't saying out loud. When they reached the bed and breakfast, Lena stopped at the front steps. "This is it. Mrs. Callahan runs the place. She'll take care of you." Jake hesitated, surprising himself with how much he didn't want to say goodbye just yet. "Thanks, Lena," he said sincerely. She nodded. "Try not to get lost again, city boy." With one last teasing smile, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Jake stood there for a moment before finally stepping inside. He had no idea why, but something about this town about her was already messing with his carefully structured life. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he minded. Jake woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window, the golden morning light filtering through the lace curtains. He blinked, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The bed beneath him was softer than he was used to, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. Right, the bed and breakfast, the tiny town, Lena. He pushed himself up, rubbing his face. He had intended to wake early, refuel, and get back on the road, but something about last night had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the quiet. Or maybe it was the woman with the knowing smile and warm hazel eyes. Shaking off the thought, he got dressed and made his way downstairs. The scent of fresh coffee and something sweet wafted through the air, drawing him toward a cozy dining area where a few guests were already seated. Mrs. Callahan, the elderly owner, greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning, dear. Coffee, please," Jake said, taking a seat near the window. As she poured him a steaming cup, she studied him with an amused glint in her eyes. "Lena mentioned you got lost on your way to Riverton. You're not the first city boy to wander in here unexpectedly." Jake smirked. "That obvious, huh?" she chuckled. "You stick out like a sore thumb, but don't worry, we don't bite." Before he could reply, the door swung open and she walked in. Lena. She carried a brown paper bag in one hand, her hair still slightly tousled from the morning breeze. When her eyes met his, she hesitated for the briefest second before continuing toward the counter, placing the bag down. "Morning, Mrs. Callahan," she said cheerfully. Then, glancing at Jake, "City boy," Jake exhaled a quiet laugh. "Lena." Mrs. Callahan patted Jake's shoulder. "I'll leave you two to it," she said with a knowing smile before shuffling away. Lena leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You sleep all right?" "Surprisingly, yeah," he admitted. "Figured I'd grab some coffee, then head out." She nodded, but something about her expression made him pause. "What?" he asked. She hesitated. "Well, about that. The gas station had a delivery delay, no fuel until tomorrow morning." Jake stared at her. "You're kidding." She shook her head, biting her lip like she was trying not to laugh. "Afraid not," he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Of course." "You could take it as a sign," she suggested playfully. "A sign. To slow down, stay a little while, enjoy the world outside of meetings and traffic." Jake smirked. "And what exactly would I do here all day?" Lena tapped her chin in mock thought. "Well, you could wander around, get lost again, or," she tilted her head, "you could let me show you around." He raised a brow. "You offering to be my tour guide? Why not? You're stuck here anyway, might as well see what makes this place special." Jake considered her for a moment. He wasn't the type to indulge in detours. His life was structured, planned down to the minute. But there was something about Lena's easy confidence, the way she looked at him like she already knew he would say yes, that made him want to abandon reason entirely. "All right," he said, surprising himself. "Show me what's so special about this place." Her smile widened. "Deal." The day unfolded in a way Jake never could have predicted. Lena took him through the heart of Willow Creek, pointing out small details he would have missed on his own. The old bookstore that had been around for 3 generations. The tiny park where kids played tag beneath the towering oak trees. The bridge over the river where, according to her, people made wishes and swore they sometimes came true. "You don't actually believe that, do you?" he asked, leaning against the railing. Lena shrugged. "Stranger things have happened." Jake huffed a laugh, shaking his head. "Like me getting stuck in this town." "Exactly." She nudged him playfully, and the warmth of her touch lingered even after she pulled away. They ended up at the diner for lunch. Lena moved behind the counter like she belonged there, which of course she did. She poured him a cup of coffee without asking, then placed a plate of homemade pie in front of him. "On the house," she said. Jake eyed her suspiciously. "Trying to bribe me into liking this place," she grinned. "Is it working?" He took a bite, and the burst of flavor caught him off guard. "Damn," Lena watched, clearly amused. "Good, huh?" Jake swallowed, then set his fork down. "I'm not admitting anything," she laughed, and the sound was light, effortless. It sank into his bones, warming something in him that had been cold for a long time. The afternoon passed in a blur. They walked through the outskirts of town, where the fields stretched wide, golden under the sun. At some point they ended up by the lake, the water shimmering under the late afternoon light. Lena skipped a stone across the surface, watching as it bounced 3 times before sinking. "You ever think about leaving?" Jake asked, curious. She was quiet for a moment. "I used to." She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "But the more I tried to picture myself anywhere else, the more I realized this is where I belong." Jake understood that kind of certainty. He had always known his place was in the fast-moving world of business, where things never slowed down. And yet, standing here in this quiet town with her, he wasn't so sure anymore. Lena tilted her head, studying him. "You're different than I expected." "Yeah, I figured you'd be more, I don't know, uptight, but you're actually kind of all right, city boy," Jake scoffed. "High praise," she grinned. "Don't let it go to your head." The sun began to set, casting everything in hues of gold and crimson. Jake knew he should feel restless about losing another day. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't. Lena tossed another stone into the water. "Guess you'll be leaving tomorrow." "Yeah," he said, though the word didn't sit right in his chest. She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that made his throat tighten. Jake wasn't sure what it meant, but he wasn't ready to say goodbye just yet. The next morning, Jake found himself standing outside the diner, hands in his pockets, staring at the familiar neon sign that had welcomed him the night before last. He should have been on the road by now, heading toward Riverton, toward the life he knew, the life he had built with careful precision. But instead, he was lingering. Lena stepped out onto the porch, stretching her arms over her head as the morning sun bathed her in golden light. She caught sight of him and tilted her head, amusement flickering in her hazel eyes. "You're still here," she said, her lips curving into a knowing smile. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, guess I am. Gas station open now." It wasn't a question. "Yeah," he admitted. Lena nodded, leaning against the wooden railing. "So, what's keeping you?" Jake had no answer, at least not one he was ready to admit. He had spent the whole night tossing and turning, trying to convince himself that the pull he felt toward this place, toward her, was nothing more than a passing moment, a distraction from his real life. But the truth was, something had shifted in him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next move, the next deal, the next deadline. He was just here. Lena watched him carefully, as if she could see the war waging inside him. Then, as if deciding something, she pushed off the railing. "Come with me," she said. Jake frowned. "Where?" "You'll see." He hesitated for only a second before following her. They walked through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, the early morning air crisp and fresh. The town was just waking up, shopkeepers unlocking doors, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery, a couple of kids riding their bikes down the sidewalk. Lena led him past the familiar spots he had seen the day before, further than he had gone before, until they reached a small clearing just beyond the town limits. Jake stopped short. Nestled against the backdrop of rolling hills and golden fields was an old wooden barn, its red paint faded by time, but still standing strong. Wildflowers grew along the fence, swaying gently in the breeze. Lena turned to him, her expression softer now. "This was my dad's." Jake glanced at her. "Was." She nodded, stepping forward, running her fingers along the wooden beam of the entrance. "He passed away a few years ago, left the diner to my mom and me. But this," she gestured to the barn, "this was his dream." Jake stepped closer, peering inside. Sunlight streamed through the open doors, illuminating the worn wooden floors, the shelves lined with tools and old equipment. It was rustic, untouched by time, yet filled with something that made Jake's chest tighten. It was supposed to be a place where people could gather, Lena continued, her voice tinged with something wistful. A space for the town to come together, weddings, celebrations, even just a place to dance under the stars, she exhaled. But after he died, it just sat here. Jake looked at her, at the way her fingers traced the edges of the wood like it was something sacred. "Why haven't you done anything with it?" he asked gently. Lena glanced at him, a small, sad smile on her lips. "Because I was scared. Scared I'd mess it up. Scared it wouldn't be what he wanted." Jake understood fear. He had spent his whole life outrunning it, burying it beneath work, success, control. But standing here in this quiet, sunlit space, he saw it for what it was. A choice. "You could still do it," he said, his voice steady. "Make it yours." Lena studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her gaze. Then she stepped closer, so close he could see the tiny freckles dusting her nose, the way the morning light turned her eyes into molten gold. "And what about you, city boy?" she murmured. "Are you always running toward something or just running away?" Jake's breath caught, because for the first time he didn't know the answer. Lena reached out, brushing a stray leaf from his shoulder, her fingertips barely grazing his shirt. But it was enough to send a jolt of something electric through him, something undeniable. His pulse hammered in his throat. They were standing too close now, the air between them charged, heavy with something neither of them wanted to name. Jake swallowed hard. "Lena." She held his gaze, unwavering. "Tell me you don't feel it." He couldn't, because he did. Every second he spent in this town with her was unraveling everything he thought he knew about himself. Without thinking, without hesitation, he reached for her, but just as his fingers brushed her waist, a voice called out from the road. "Lena." They jolted apart, breathless. A man was approaching, tall and broad-shouldered, with a familiar ease in his stride. Lena's expression shifted, something guarded slipping into place. Jake clenched his jaw. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice tighter than he intended. Lena exhaled, her gaze flickering toward him before settling back on the man approaching. "That," she murmured, "is my ex." Lena's ex-boyfriend stopped a few feet away, his sharp blue eyes flicking between her and Jake with a scrutiny that made Jake's spine stiffen. He was about Jake's height, maybe an inch taller, with the kind of rugged handsomeness that suggested he belonged in a place like this. His expression was unreadable, but there was something territorial in the way he looked at Lena. "Didn't expect to see you out here," the man said, his voice casual but edged with something Jake couldn't quite place. Lena crossed her arms, her stance shifting slightly. "I could say the same to you, Wes. What do you need?" Jake didn't miss the flicker of tension in her posture. "I heard you were showing someone around town. Figured I'd come see the guy who's got everyone talking." Wes's gaze landed on Jake, assessing, measuring. Jake met it head-on. He wasn't the kind of man to back down, especially not from someone who was clearly trying to stake a claim that wasn't his to make. "Jake Matthews," he said, extending a hand. Wes eyed it for a beat too long before shaking it. His grip was firm, almost challenging. "Wes Harper," he replied. "Lena and I go way back." Jake didn't react, but he felt something tighten in his chest at the implication. Lena exhaled, clearly impatient. "Wes, whatever this is, I don't have time for it." Wes's jaw ticked. "I just wanted to check in, make sure you're doing okay." His gaze flickered toward the barn. "You haven't been out here in a while." Jake glanced at Lena, catching the way her fingers curled slightly against her arms. "I'm fine," she said, her voice even but cool. Wes hesitated before turning his attention back to Jake. "How long are you staying?" Jake held his gaze. "Haven't decided yet." Something unreadable passed over Wes's face before he nodded. "Well, enjoy your time here. Just know this town doesn't take kindly to people passing through and making promises they can't keep." The words were pointed, but Jake didn't flinch. Lena's lips parted, her frustration evident. But Wes was already stepping back. "I'll see you around, Lena." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind nothing but a tense silence. Jake exhaled, turning to Lena. "Charming guy." Lena rolled her eyes. "Don't start. I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to." Jake studied her, noting the way she was staring at the barn, her expression distant. "How long were you two together?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. She hesitated. "A few years. We grew up together. It was easy." "But," she exhaled, shaking her head. "But easy doesn't always mean right." Jake understood that better than he wanted to admit. Lena turned to face him fully, searching his expression. "Are you really thinking about staying?" Jake didn't answer right away, because the truth was, he didn't know. All he knew was that the idea of leaving, of driving away from this town, from her, felt wrong in a way he hadn't expected. Instead of answering, he reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Lena inhaled sharply, her eyes widening slightly. "Jake." He stepped closer, his voice low. "Tell me you don't feel this." She didn't move away, didn't pull her hand from his, but before she could speak, a voice called from the distance. "Lena." "We need you at the diner," she blinked, the moment breaking. Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself to step back. Lena swallowed hard before nodding. "I should go." Jake nodded, even though every part of him wanted to stop her, but he didn't. Because if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was that Lena wasn't the kind of woman who could be rushed. And for once in his life, Jake Matthews was willing to wait. Jake paced outside the diner, hands shoved deep into his pockets, frustration coiling in his chest. He hadn't meant to let things get this tangled, hadn't planned on caring about this town or her. But now, Lena was under his skin, in his thoughts, in every damn breath he took. After she had disappeared inside, he'd spent the afternoon wandering, trying to clear his head. But no matter where he went, everything kept leading back to her. The way she had looked at him in the barn, the unspoken something lingering between them, it wasn't just in his head. It was real. And it scared the hell out of him. Because for the first time in his life, Jake Matthews wanted to stay, and he had no idea what to do with that. With a sigh, he pushed open the diner door, the familiar chime of the bell ringing above him. It was quieter now, only a few late afternoon customers lingering at the booths, and there she was. Lena stood behind the counter, scribbling something into a notebook. She didn't look up right away, but when she did, her eyes softened for a fraction of a second before she masked it with a small, unreadable smile. "You're still here," she murmured. Jake exhaled a quiet laugh, sliding onto a stool. "Guess I am." She leaned against the counter, studying him. "What happened to being in a hurry to get back to your real life?" He hesitated, fingers tapping against the countertop. "Maybe I'm not in such a hurry anymore." Lena's breath hitched, barely noticeable, but Jake caught it. "You don't belong here," she said quietly, though there was no bite in her words, just truth. "I don't know," he murmured, tilting his head as he looked at her. "Lately, I'm not so sure where I belong." Lena's eyes flickered with something unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then finally, she sighed, setting down her pen. "Come with me," Jake blinked. "Where?" She untied her apron, tossing it onto the counter. "Just come on." Without waiting for his response, she slipped out the door. Jake hesitated for only a second before following. They walked in silence, the evening air settling around them, the sky painted in soft hues of lavender and gold. Lena led him down a path he hadn't been before, past the outskirts of town, until they reached a small hill overlooking the fields. There was an old wooden bench nestled beneath a towering oak tree, the kind of place that had probably been here for decades, untouched by time. She sat first, hugging her arms around herself. Jake followed, leaving just enough space between them for the air to crackle with unspoken words. For a while, they just sat there, watching the sun dip lower, the wind rustling through the grass. Lena broke the silence first. "I used to come here with my dad." Jake glanced at her, waiting. She exhaled slowly. Whenever I was overwhelmed or just needed to think, he'd bring me here. He'd tell me to close my eyes, listen to the wind, and remember that no matter how lost I felt, I was never really lost. Jake swallowed, something tightening in his chest. Lena turned to him then, her gaze searching. "Are you lost, Jake?" His throat worked. "I don't know." She nodded, as if she already knew that would be his answer. They sat in silence for a moment before she spoke again, softer this time. "I don't want to be something temporary for you." Jake stiffened. Lena exhaled, looking away. "You'll leave. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but eventually. And I won't be the woman who waits around for a man who never planned to stay." Jake's pulse thundered. "Lena," she shook her head, cutting him off. "I can't do that to myself." And suddenly, he understood. She wasn't pushing him away because she didn't feel what he felt. She was pushing him away because she did, because she was afraid, because she had already lost before. Jake inhaled sharply. He had spent his whole life avoiding attachments, avoiding anything that could hold him in place. But now, for the first time, he wanted something more. He wanted her, and that terrified him. But not enough to walk away, not this time. Lena stood abruptly, brushing off her jeans. "I should head back." Jake caught her wrist before she could move away. She froze. Slowly, she turned to face him, her breath uneven. Jake swallowed hard. "What if I don't want to leave?" Her lips parted, her eyes wide. "Jake, I mean it." His voice was rough, raw. "I don't have all the answers. Hell, I don't even know what this means, but I know I don't want to walk away from you." Lena's throat bobbed. "And what happens when you change your mind?" "When you wake up and realize this was just a detour." Jake stepped closer, his grip tightening slightly. "Then maybe this is the first time I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Lena sucked in a shaky breath. Jake reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering. "Tell me you don't feel this." She closed her eyes, her lashes trembling, and then, after what felt like forever, she whispered, "I do." Jake's pulse roared. He cupped her face, tilting it up to meet his. "Then don't run." Lena's breath caught, and then finally, she surged forward. Their lips crashed together, desperate, aching, filled with every unsaid word, every stolen moment, every feeling they had fought against. Jake groaned, pulling her closer, his hands tangling in her hair. Lena melted against him, her fingers gripping his shirt as if she was afraid he'd disappear, but he wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Lena rested her forehead against his. Jake smiled, his thumb tracing her cheek. "So what now?" Lena let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I have no idea." Jake grinned. "Good, then we'll figure it out together." Lena exhaled, her lips curling into a small, hopeful smile. And just like that, Jake Matthews, the man who had spent his whole life running, finally stopped. Because he had found something worth staying for. Jake had never felt more certain about anything in his life. Lena was in his arms, her breath still uneven from the kiss they had just shared. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't planning his exit or calculating his next move. He was here in this moment with her, and he wasn't going anywhere. Lena pulled back just enough to look at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. "You really mean it," she whispered, her fingers still curled in the fabric of his shirt as if she was afraid to let go. Jake cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "I meant every word," he murmured. "I don't want to leave, Lena, not without knowing what this is." "What we could be," she swallowed, her gaze flickering with something vulnerable, something hesitant. "Jake." He could hear the unspoken words, the fear of believing in something that might not last. So he did the only thing he could. He held her tighter, grounding her in the certainty he felt. "I know I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I know how I feel about you. And I know I don't want this to be just a moment that passes." Lena closed her eyes for a second before exhaling softly. When she opened them again, they were filled with something warmer, something that made Jake's chest tighten. "Then stay," she whispered. Jake's breath caught. Lena let out a small, shaky laugh. "Stay for as long as you want." Stay and see if this, she gestured between them, her fingers brushing his chest, is real. Jake didn't hesitate. Okay, he murmured, his lips brushing against hers again, softer this time, slower, as if sealing the promise between them. Lena melted into him, and for the first time she wasn't holding back. And just like that, something shifted. Jake wasn't just a man passing through, he was here with her, and he had no plans to leave. The next few weeks passed in a blur, but for the first time, Jake didn't feel like he was racing toward something. He was just living. He woke up in Willow Creek every morning, the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the diner, the quiet hum of small-town life settling into his bones in a way that felt unexpectedly right. And Lena, she was everywhere. In the way she laughed behind the counter at the diner, in the way she challenged him to skip stones at the lake, in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. She was becoming home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they found themselves back at the barn, standing side by side, staring at the weathered wood. Lena exhaled, her fingers brushing against his. I think I want to fix it up, she admitted softly. Jake turned to her, surprised. The barn, she nodded. For my dad, for me, for us. Something warm spread through Jake's chest at her words. She glanced at him, biting her lip. Would you help me? Jake didn't even have to think about it. Of course. And just like that, they started building something together. The days turned into weeks, and the barn began to change. With every board they replaced, with every nail they hammered in, it became more than just an old building. It became a symbol of something new, something Jake hadn't even realized he had been searching for. One evening, as they stood in the middle of the now repaired barn, Lena let out a breathless laugh, spinning in a slow circle. Can you believe it? She whispered. Jake watched her, his heart full. Yeah, he murmured, I can. She turned to him then, her eyes shining. Jake. He stepped closer, his hands settling on her waist. Lena, I love you. She inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping his arms. Jake smiled, brushing his nose against hers. I love you, he repeated, because it wasn't something he wanted to keep inside any longer. I didn't plan for any of this, but now I can't imagine anything else. Lena's breath hitched. And then, before he could say anything else, she crashed into him, her lips finding his in a kiss that said everything she had been too afraid to put into words. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his. I love you too, she whispered. Jake closed his eyes, his arms tightening around her. This was everything he never knew he needed. And this time, he wasn't letting go.